So now Cleopatra is involved in the Roman ongoing civil war, whether she wants to be or not. And she gets a letter from Mark Antony inviting her to come to Anatolia, to Tarsus. And she delays, she thinks about it, and he says, please come, and there's this back and forth. Obviously, the two of them are trying to decide who has the upper hand in this relationship. But she does show up. According to the Roman documentation, she shows up with as much ostentation as you can possibly imagine. Decked out. Her ship is decked out, covered with gold and silver, according to the texts. She herself dressed as a goddess with crowns that are more expensive than anything anyone can imagine. And the Romans are talking about this as if she's greedy, drama-obsessed, self-involved. I would look at this and say that Cleopatra is showing up with her best assets displayed most prominently. Essentially, she is saying to the Romans, I'm the money. You want money to fight your other competitors? You need me. You have to work with me. You have to do what I say. She is in a sense trying to gain the upper hand by being ostentatious with her wealth. She and Mark Antony create a political and sexual alliance. Mark Antony ends up moving in with her in Alexandria, staying there for years at a time. The more dug in he gets with his relationship with Egypt, the less he can go back to Rome. He knows what happened to Julius Caesar, murdered on the steps of the Senate. The last thing he wants is for that to happen to him too. So he's paranoid. He's staying away from Rome. But he ends up going all in with Cleopatra. He has no other means of gaining cash, it seems. When Cleopatra asks him to murder her sister, Arsinoe, on the steps of the temple of Ephesus in Anatolia, it seems he agrees. He sees that Arsinoe is being used by other Roman warlords, other senators, to be placed onto the Egyptian throne in a coalition with them. So he has to remove that threat. He's gone all in with Cleopatra. So he actually agrees, and he does, it seems, have Arsinoe murdered. So that's one more Ptolemaic sibling of Cleopatra's that has bitten the dust. I think it's the last one, actually. Yeah, she's the last one. So now it's just Cleopatra. She's the only child of Ptolemy XII left. But she is effectively able to use Roman military support against her own Ptolemaic family. Very clever girl, very clever thing to do. In 40 BCE, she bears him twins. So now she has 3 children with Roman warlords. She has Caesarion, Ptolemy XV, now a boy and girl twin, Set. She will name them after the sun and the moon. She will also name them Cleopatra and Ptolemy. So she links them to ideology of divine kingship, but she also links them to her Ptolemaic dynastic lineage. She pays for a campaign of Mark Antony's into the east, following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, invading the area of Parthia near modern-day Iran, or in modern-day Iran, where he fails disastrously. He loses everything in this invasion of Parthia. He tries to rally by then invading Armenia, taking some booty from Armenia, taking the royal family, bringing them to Alexandria, displaying them in a kind of triumph there, and trying to consolidate his forces. Eventually, Cleopatra will bear Mark Antony another child, this time a son. So she will have 3 children with Mark Antony. And meanwhile, he has essentially moved to Alexandria. They're almost like a king and queen pair, except he's the informal lover that's kind of been invited in. He's the brawn, she's the money. He's the military, she's the brains. She's certainly the womb. She's able to produce all of these kids. And she creates this spectacle, this display where she has all of her family, all of her children seated on thrones before her people in Alexandria. And she names each one of them as king or queen over a different territory. She names her son Caesarion as co-ruler alongside her of Egypt. She will take a son and a daughter and say, you are king of Armenia, you are queen of Parthia, you are king of Cyprus. And she will essentially claim all of these different lands of the Eastern Mediterranean. She will use Mark Antony to help her do that. Because on paper, Mark Antony is a triumvir. He is a member of the Roman triumvirate. He is able to legally take Roman lands and transfer them to Cleopatra's power. Of course, Rome's not going to agree to this. Rome is going to fight back, but he still does it. And actually sends letters back to Rome saying, I have transferred this part to Cleopatra. I have transferred this land to Cleopatra. So Cleopatra, in many ways, is sitting very pretty. She has all of these lands nominally named to her. Some of them she actually has control over. She has named her children as wielders of power over these different lands. She has a number of children who are growing up, getting stronger by the day, that she can give more authority to. She seems to have created cohesion with her Ptolemaic children rather than competition and discord, which is really something. But essentially what is going to happen that will ruin it all is the Battle of Actium. And she will be in league with Mark Antony as the two of them face Octavian in this naval battle that they both lose disastrously. So in 33 BCE, Octavian declares war against Cleopatra. He wants to try to keep Mark Antony out of it. It's easier for him to declare war against Egypt. And then in 31 BCE, we have this naval battle that they lose for a variety of reasons. And this isn't a military history class, so if you're interested in that, you may look. It's very complicated stuff. And both of them run home to Egypt. Antony takes a more circuitous route through North Africa. Cleopatra goes directly to Alexandria. She raises the flags of her ships as if in victory, trying to show her people that she is not coming back in defeat. She needs some political strength as she comes back, even after this great defeat. It takes a good year for all of this to work out. But what will essentially happen is Mark Antony will lose all of his military support. He will be a man alone. Cleopatra now has targets on her back and on the backs of every single one of her children, because her children must now be eliminated. Her children are now a threat to Octavian, who wants to take Egypt and take the whole game. Octavian wants to do something to Rome that has never been done before. He wants to consolidate power to one man. He wants to end the civil wars. He wants to create this Pax Romana, which he will create. He wants to stop the bloodshed. He will not create a kingship, because that's something the Romans distrust. It's too Cleopatra-like. It's too Eastern and Orientalist. It's not something that we want. He will end up calling himself Caesar Augustus. He will take the name of his dead uncle, the martyr now, and use it as a title, almost of kingship, but not. The Romans can't touch the idea of kingship. But first he has to deal with Cleopatra. So he goes to Egypt. He works, it seems, with Cleopatra. They write letters back and forth to each other. Mark Antony, according to the documentation, he's done with. Whenever Mark Antony sends a messenger, the guy gets killed, and so he doesn't even want to talk to him. He tells Cleopatra she's got to murder Mark Antony for him. Should we believe these things? They're coming from Roman authors. It's not very clear. The Roman authors also tell us that Cleopatra then finds a way to hide herself in her tomb, surrounded by all of her treasures, all of her gold, almost in some maniacal, crazy way. She writes letters to Octavian saying that she's going to burn the whole place down and destroy her treasure, a truly selfish and horrific thing to do. She manages to find a way, according to the Roman authors, to sneak an asp, a poisonous snake, into her chamber. And she kills herself via suicide with that asp. We read a number of other texts from Roman authors that she even tried a number of different poisons to see which one was the least painful, the one that would be the best way out for her, by using slaves and watching them die. The suicide story of Cleopatra, as presented by the Roman authors, is one of the best pieces of propaganda you will ever read. We don't know how she died. We don't know if Octavian himself killed her. We don't know if she actually did commit suicide. But the way that it is represented presents her as a truly selfish, self-involved woman who cares nothing about her people or her country. This is what the Romans are reading. This is what they are consuming and what they think of when they think of Egypt. And Mark Antony is folded into that propaganda. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, huge problem. If the kid had not been born to Julius Caesar, he wouldn't have had the target on his back. Maybe Octavian would have let him live. maybe Octavian would have let him be Ptolemy the 15th, another can kicked down the road. Maybe he wouldn't have taken Egypt. But this kid is Caesar's blood heir. He may not be his legal, legitimate heir, but he is his actual son, and he will have a claim. So, when Ptolemy the 15th, Caesarion, is running into exile, into the south, into deeper southern Africa, into modern-day Sudan, he receives a letter from Octavian saying, come back, I'm going to put you on the throne, it'll be okay. This is what the Roman authors tell us. And he comes back and he is killed on his way back to Alexandria, eliminated by Octavian, who will set himself up as the princeps, as the first among many, as Caesar Augustus, without that threat of Caesar's blood heir. Some of the other children, the children of Mark Antony, he will allow to live. And he will allow them to live with Octavia, Mark Antony's wife, his erstwhile wife before Mark Antony divorced her. Remember all of that complicated history when we talked about Rome. And some of those children live to adulthood. One of the daughters lives to adulthood and ends up marrying the Numidian king and setting herself up as a North African queen and claiming power through Cleopatra. Her son will end up being so powerful and another competitor against the Roman emperor that he will be eliminated by Roman imperial forces. So the family will continue to live on. Cleopatra's offspring will continue to live on in some way, shape, or form until they were finally eliminated about 100 years later. Pulled out by the roots, there will be no Ptolemies left. With Cleopatra's death in 31 BCE, Egypt is essentially bereft of native rule. It is brought into the Roman Empire as just another province. And they will not name a senator in charge of it. They will put a garrison leader there. And they will administer it in a way such that the funds go directly to the princeps, to the emperor, to the first among many. It is Egypt that centralizes Rome for the first time. It is Egypt that allows one senator to stand on the backs of all of the others and claim the whole show. That's how powerful Egypt is. And now we can get a little revisionist in our history and think about Cleopatra herself. If it hadn't been for some poor military scheming at the Battle of Actium, if she had won, what could potentially have happened? Could Mark Antony have entered into Rome in triumph with his new Eastern bride, with his new dynastic ambitions as king over the whole show? Would the Romans have ever accepted that? My revisionist history, and it's always fun to be hypothetical, says no, that the Roman system of competition would have taken him down. It would have been too much power, and to claim some sort of kingship with dynastic succession like that, with a foreign queen, was too much for the Romans to take. He would have been eliminated in one way, shape, or form. Cleopatra was doing her best to survive, to fight, to win the whole show. But her system against this organically, constantly growing, competitive Roman system could not win. And she would just be another martyr along the way, another Hypatia, another Boudica, another Valida, another Zenobia. Now let's talk about Cleopatra's strategy. What was her strategy, maybe in comparison to Hatshepsut, maybe in comparison to Tawastret, or some of the other Egyptian female leaders of state that we have seen? She is the only one to use her sexual power outright, to try to use it like a man would, to place the next ruler on the throne. And she was successful. She places her son on the throne alongside her. And if he hadn't been killed on the way back with this letter from Octavian, maybe she would have been able to continue that legacy, that genetic legacy after her. But her sexual power worked in a different way as well. She used it politically. She used it in a very Roman way, as informal political power that was reified through sex. In the same way that Romans constantly had lovers with one another to gain political connections, Cleopatra is doing the same, taking on Roman warlords as lovers to gain political connection, to co-opt and manipulate, to gain monetary connection, and it works for a short period of time. It is not successful in the long term because the Roman system is always going to be a moving target of competing forces. Even if she picks the right warlord, even if he's brilliant and wins the entire show, he will become too problematic and he will end up being taken out by other competitive senators. She set herself up in some ways in a no-win situation. Now, her strategy wasn't just sexual. No one's going to be able to rule that way. What were her other strategies for maintaining power? Well, this is a well-educated woman. It seems to be she was also a militarily astute woman. She understood how to use economics to create military power. She is one of the few females in our story to take up arms against a man as a leader of state. She was able to use informal military power, removing rivals of her own family, sisters, brothers. She was able to use the Roman warlords to do that as well. And the main strategy that Cleopatra is using is an Eastern kingship dynastic strategy, the attempt to use her own biological sexual power to create children with her chosen men. Remember, I use that word sperm donor. I'm not using that facetiously. In a way, it's her perfect strategy. She's not going to marry them. She's not going to give them legal power over her. She's not going to reify them politically. She just needs their sperm. She just needs their offspring, such that she can put those children into the next dynasty as child of Julius Caesar, child of Mark Antony. The problem with this strategy is that she needs Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to also succeed. If those two are taken out, then her children will now be seen as a threat to those men who are able to eliminate those Roman warlords, Julius Caesar or Mark Antony. So in the end, Cleopatra is unsuccessful. And there are many reasons why she failed, many of which have been mentioned already. How much of this can we blame on the Roman warlords? If Caesar had played it differently and not been murdered on the steps of the Senate, if he had heard word of this, if he had been able to outmanipulate, maybe take the princeps title himself before Octavian, maybe Cleopatra would have fared better. But he ends up being murdered on the steps of the Senate, so he's not that successful. Mark Antony, it seems, doesn't have the military acumen she might have thought he did. He fails in his invasion of Parthia. He fails in the Battle of Actium. If he had been a better military strategist, could she have succeeded for longer? Yes. The answer is indeed yes. How that would have worked long term, we can only hypothesize. But we do have to put part of the blame for her failure on the men with whom she was linked, the men with whom she had children, the men whom she took on as lovers. The sexual links that she made, those offspring that she had, because those men ended up failing, in some ways they spelled her demise as well. Cleopatra's sexual links with these Romans puts a target on her back in the same way it put targets on their back. So not only does she need to be eliminated, but her children do too. If she hadn't pushed all into the Roman political game and tried to play it from farther away, she could have kept herself safer. But instead, she jumps in with both feet and engages in the sexual reification of political power in the Roman way, rather than letting them create their own political discord and trying to be a Ptolemy from afar. Maybe she had no choice but to do that. But if she had distanced herself more, maybe she could have stayed alive a little bit longer. Maybe Egypt could have survived a little bit longer. In the end, I will lay Cleopatra's failure on two main things. Number one, environmental, and she has no control over this. She's dealing with famines the likes of which Egypt hasn't seen for generations. She doesn't have the wealth and the economic stability that the Ptolemaic kings before her had. That puts her on the back foot. She is always going to be weakened by that. And number two, she is up against a system of Roman competition and aggression that grows organically from its own competition. And against that, it seems, even against this Ptolemaic competitive system, she will always be unsuccessful. Because if we look at the Roman competition versus the Ptolemaic competition ends up killing rivals but without growth. The Roman competition encourages growth. It encourages invasion of other places. And the Roman competition will end up gobbling up the Ptolemaic competition in the long term, whether Cleopatra had held out longer or not. And now one last thing I want you to think about. As you work through the Cleopatra information, go back through Hatshepsut in your mind and remember that Cleopatra is born into a particular context, born into a particular time period of history. I want you to think, which female, in your estimation, was more of a badass? Which female was able to play it better? Both ruled for about 22 years. It's amazing that the time periods are very, very similar. Both ruled always with a man attached to them. One, however, Hatshepsut, left Egypt better than she found it. The other, Cleopatra, did not. Egypt becomes just a province after her death. But, you think, oh, okay, well, it's clear. I know the answer. But Hatshepsut's name is unpronounceable to most of us today. Shakespeare did not write plays about Hatshepsut. She is not part of our cultural memory. She is not remembered. She has no legacy. She did it so well and so perfectly and so traditionally that everyone was able to take it from her, rename it, reclaim it. She is invisible to us. Cleopatra is not. Cleopatra stands to us as an ambitious woman of power, not afraid of her ambition, not afraid of showing it, not afraid of fighting against Roman aggression. She sets up a model of female power that is more unafraid, that is more unabashed. She goes all in and she loses, but we remember her after. So it brings back this question that haunts the entire class. If women really do rule differently, if they rule more pragmatically, if they rule more to protect their own, for less bloodshed, to keep the status quo going, then Hatshepsut is more successful. Fewer people died. There was less stress. There was less trauma. Cleopatra, on the other hand, she's born into a very difficult time period, but the amount of bloodshed that surrounds her is enormous. And she is ruling more like a man, more balls to the wall, more all in to destroy and take more ambitiously. And it seems she is not ruling in that feminine way of keeping the costs down. She is being as aggressive as any man would.